Emma Whitmore threw the wedding ring into the fireplace on a Tuesday morning, not in anger, not in tears, but in the terrifying calm of a woman who had finally decided she was done. She watched it melt. She didn't cry. She made coffee instead. And that was the last time Emma Whitmore allowed herself to want anything from another human being. That was 7 years ago. Now a stranger was standing on her porch, and he was saying words she hadn't heard in a decade. Your sister sent me. Before we begin, if this story finds you at the right moment, if you've ever built walls around your heart and wondered whether opening the door again was worth the risk, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and follow Emma's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. Emma Whitmore threw the wedding ring into the fireplace on a Tuesday morning, not in anger, not in tears, but in the terrifying calm of a woman who had finally decided she was done. She watched it melt. She didn't cry. She made coffee instead. And that was the last time Emma Whitmore allowed herself to want anything from another human being. That was 7 years ago. Now a stranger was standing on her porch, and he was saying words she hadn't heard in a decade. Your sister sent me. The autumn of 1882 arrived in Willow Creek, the way most hard things arrived in Emma Whitmore's life, quietly without warning, and with no regard for whether she was ready. She was 30 years old, and she had not been ready for anything since the morning her first husband locked her out of their home in Ohio, with nothing but the dress on her back, and a suitcase he'd packed himself, deciding in his infinite cruelty which parts of her life she was permitted to keep. She kept the sewing needles. She left behind everything else. That had been 7 years ago. 7 years of building. 7 years of learning that the only hands she could trust were her own too. 7 years of mornings in a small workroom above a small shop on the main street of a small frontier town where nobody knew her name until she made it mean something. Emma Whitmore's dress shop had become the finest establishment of its kind in all of Willow Creek, which was not saying a great deal because Willow Creek was itself a modest sort of place. A town that had grown up fast along a railroad line and never quite figured out what it wanted to be when it grew up. But the women of Willow Creek wore Emma's dresses to their weddings, and their funerals, and their Sunday services, and that meant something in a place where the only other option was ordering fabric from a catalog and hoping it arrived before the season changed. Emma had built that, stitch by stitch, dollar by dollar, rejection by rejection. She had arrived with 43 cents. A broken heart she refused to examine, and a stubbornness that her late mother had always called her finest quality and her worst. She chose to call it survival. Her days had a rhythm that she had come to love with the fierce possessiveness of someone who had learned the hard way that routine was a form of safety. She woke before dawn. She lit the stove. She made strong coffee. She sat at her work table while the town was still sleeping, and she sewed in the silence that she had decided was not loneliness, but rather peace, a distinction she made with great frequency and considerable effort. By 7, the shop was open. By noon, she had usually taken 3 orders and declined at least one inappropriate comment from a man who thought her singleness was an invitation. By evening, she climbed the narrow staircase to the small apartment above the shop, ate whatever simple meal she had the energy to prepare and read until her eyes closed. She did not think about Ohio. She did not think about the ring she had melted down and sold for coin. She did not think about the fact that some nights the silence above the shop felt less like peace and more like the inside of a sealed box. She was fine. Emma Whitmore was absolutely, completely, irreversibly fine, which was exactly what she was telling herself on that particular Tuesday afternoon in October, when the knock came at the front door of the shop an hour after she had turned the closed sign and climbed upstairs for the evening. She ignored it. The knock came again. "We're closed," she called from the top of the staircase, not moving from her chair. The knock came a third time. Emma set down her mending with the controlled irritation of a woman who had cultivated her patience into something very close to a weapon and descended the stairs. She opened the door and found the last thing she expected. Howe was tall, not imposingly so, but the kind of tall that takes up space without trying to. His coat was the dark brown of dried earth after a long dry summer. His hat was in his hands, which surprised her. Most men on her porch kept their hats on, as though they wanted the brim to do the intimidating for them. This man had removed it. His dark hair was pressed flat where the hat had sat, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the gray of a morning sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. He looked tired. Not the tired of a man who needed sleep, but the kind of tired that accumulates over years and settles into the lines around a person's mouth like it means to stay. Emma did not find him handsome precisely. She had trained herself out of noticing such things. But she noticed, despite her best efforts, that there was nothing aggressive in the way he stood. He was not leaning into the doorframe the way some men did, establishing territory before the first word was spoken. He was standing back slightly, as though he was aware that the porch was hers, and that he was a guest upon it. She did not know what to do with that. "Shop's closed," she said, because it was the simplest true thing available to her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know. I apologize for the hour. I'm not here about the shop." "Then what are you here about?" He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not nervousness exactly, but a careful sort of steadiness. The way a man looks when he has rehearsed a thing many times and is about to discover whether the rehearsal was sufficient. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. "I work a ranch about 40 miles east out past the Bridger Valley. I've been riding since before sunup." He paused. "Miss Whitmore, your sister sent me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Emma didn't move. She was aware of the cool evening air against her face, and the sound of horses somewhere down the street, and the smell of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney, and underneath all of it, the roaring silence of those 4 words sitting in the space between them. "My sister," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Abigail Carver out near Pemberton. Her husband works the Carver spread." Emma knew where Abigail lived. She had written Abigail exactly 11 letters in the past 7 years. Careful letters full of shop news and weather descriptions, and studious avoidance of anything that might prompt concern, and had received 11 letters in return. Each one warmer and more worried than the last, each one containing at least one gentle inquiry about whether Emma was truly happy, whether she ever got lonely, whether she might consider coming to stay for a while. Emma had never answered those particular parts of the letters. "Why," Emma said carefully, "would my sister send a man I've never met to knock on my door after closing time?" Caleb Mercer looked at his hat. It was the gesture of a man choosing his words with great care. "She said you'd ask that," he said. "And she said to tell you that she knows you're going to be angry. She said to tell you she's sorry in advance, and that she loves you, and—" He stopped, took a breath. "And she asked me to ask if you would consider marrying me." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. It was not the silence of a sealed box. It was the silence of an entire world stopping on its axis. Emma stared at him. Caleb Mercer stared back, and he had the decency, or perhaps the wisdom, to look profoundly uncomfortable. "Say that again," Emma said. "I know how it sounds." "Say it again anyway." "She asked me to come here and ask whether you would consider marrying me." He said it plainly, quietly, without embellishment. "I understand that is an extraordinary thing to hear from a stranger. I understand if you want me to leave immediately. I will leave immediately if that's what you want. But she asked me to at least come. She asked me to at least say the words." Emma looked at him for a long, measuring moment. He did not flinch. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurances or explanations. He simply stood there on her porch in the evening cold, holding his hat in both hands, and waited for whatever she decided to do with him. Emma had closed doors on men before. She was very good at it. She had closed doors on men who offered flattery, and men who offered money, and men who offered their protection, as though it were a gift rather than a cage. She had closed doors on men who had known her for years, and thought that entitled them to more than she was willing to give. She could close this door. She had done it many times. She was practiced at it. Her hand was on the frame. She almost did it. And then against every wall she had ever built, against every lesson she had learned in Ohio and on the road west, and in this town where she had made herself into something out of nothing, she heard herself say. "You've got 10 minutes." She did not invite him inside. She told him to sit on the porch steps, and she took the chair beside the door. Her chair, the one she brought out in the evenings when the weather permitted, and she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and looked at him with the expression that Willow Creek had come to recognize as Emma Whitmore in her least forgiving mode. "Talk," she said. Caleb sat on the steps and turned his hat in his hands and talked. He had met Abigail 6 months earlier, he said, when a fence dispute brought him to the Carver property. Her husband Thomas had hired him for a few weeks of extra work, and in the way of small ranch communities, he had taken his meals at the family table and come to know them both. "Your sister talks about you," he said. "A lot. She's proud of you. But He paused. "She worries." "I know she worries," Emma said flatly. "I've been telling her not to for 7 years. She said you'd say that." "She seems to have said a great deal." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "She told me about Ohio." Emma's jaw tightened. "Did she?" "Not the details. She didn't tell me the details. She said you'd been hurt. She said you'd built something extraordinary here because of it, and that you were the strongest person she'd ever known, and—" He stopped again, seemed to be choosing something. "And she said she was afraid the walls you built to survive were keeping everything else out too." The words hit something Emma had not expected them to hit. She kept her face very still. "What does any of that have to do with you?" she asked. Caleb looked at her directly then, and she had the unsettling impression that he was not performing anything, not charm, not confidence, not the calculated ease that men sometimes deployed when they wanted something. He just looked tired and honest. "I'm 35 years old," he said. "I've spent most of my life working other men's land. I've saved enough to buy my own out in Bridger Valley. There's a piece I've had my eye on: good water, good grass. I want to build something. I want to build it with someone." He paused. "Thomas mentioned what your sister had said about you. Not as a—" He seemed to search for the word. "Not as a transaction. More like he was telling me about someone he admired. And I wrote to Abigail, which I'll admit was probably overstepping, and she wrote back, and we wrote back and forth a few times, and somewhere in those letters she got the idea that you and I might—" "Might what?" Emma said. "Match like a pair of stockings." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. "She may have used that word," he admitted. "My sister," Emma said very evenly, "has been trying to find me a husband since I was 19 years old. She sent me Mr. Harold Finch in 1875. Mr. Harold Finch was 53 and needed someone to manage his household and his 7 children. She sent me Mr. Arden Pruitt in 1877. Mr. Arden Pruitt chewed tobacco and had opinions about how women should dress. She sent me Reverend Douglas Moore in 1879, who informed me within 10 minutes of meeting me that a woman of my temperament would benefit greatly from regular prayer and submission." Emma looked at Caleb Mercer steadily. "What makes you different from Mr. Harold Finch, Mr. Arden Pruitt, and Reverend Douglas Moore?" Caleb Mercer sat with that question for a moment. "I don't need anyone to manage my household," he said. "I don't have 7 children. I don't chew tobacco. And I don't—" He stopped. "I don't think there's anything wrong with your temperament." "High praise," Emma said. "I'm not here to give you high praise," he said. "I'm here because your sister asked me to come, and because I told her I would, and because I keep my word." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you we'd be happy together because I don't know that. I don't know you. You don't know me. What I can tell you is what I'm looking for, and what I'm not." "What are you not looking for?" "A woman who disappears," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for someone who shrinks herself down to fit what I want. I watched my mother do that for my father for 30 years, and I watched what it cost her." He said it simply, without drama. "That's not what I want." Emma looked at him. She had been looked at by many men. She had been admired by some. She had been wanted by a few. She had been spoken to with all manner of intention, from honest to calculated to cruel. She was not certain in this particular moment what she was being offered. But she was certain of one thing. This was not the speech of a man who wanted to own something. She didn't speak for a long moment. The evening had gone fully dark around them. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. A horse nickered in a stable. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees at the edge of town, with that particular October sound, dry and rushing, like the turning of many pages at once. "You said you'd leave if I wanted you to," Emma said finally. "Yes, ma'am." "And you mean that?" "I do." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stood. "I'm not agreeing to anything," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. I am not agreeing to anything. I understand. My sister had no right to do this." "No," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "She didn't. And I don't owe you anything simply because you rode 40 miles. No, ma'am, you don't owe me a thing." Emma stood in the doorway and looked at the strange, tired man sitting on her porch steps with his hat in his hands, and she felt something she had not felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. It was not attraction. It was not hope. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It was the faint, flickering possibility that she might be wrong about something she had been very certain of for a very long time. "There's a boarding house on the north end of Main Street," she said. "Mrs. Garvey runs it. She's clean and fair, and she doesn't allow trouble." Caleb Mercer stood unfolding himself from the steps. He settled his hat back on his head with the careful motion of a man who did not do things carelessly. "Thank you," he said. He turned to go. And then Emma heard herself say quietly to his back, in the voice she used when she was pretending something didn't cost her anything, "I didn't say this conversation was over." He turned back. He looked at her, and he waited. "I'm open Tuesday and Thursday evenings," she said. "After 6. If you're still in town. If you want to talk more." She kept her voice flat. Professional. Entirely devoid of anything that could be called hope. "I'm not promising anything beyond conversation." "No, ma'am," Caleb Mercer said. "Conversation's more than I expected." He tipped his hat. He walked down the porch steps and into the dark street. And Emma stood in the doorway of her own shop in the town she had built herself out of nothing, watching a stranger walk away, and felt with absolute terrifying certainty that she had just made a decision whose consequences she could not yet predict. She went inside. She locked the door. She sat down at her work table. She did not pick up her sewing. For the first time in 7 years, Emma Whitmore sat in the silence above her shop and could not pretend even to herself that it felt like peace. He came on Thursday. He knocked at 6 o'clock exactly, which told her something, either that he owned a reliable watch or that he was the kind of man who considered punctuality a matter of integrity rather than convenience. Emma had met men of both types and found the latter considerably more trustworthy. She opened the door without letting the action mean anything. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his hat was in his hands again. She had put out 2 chairs on the porch because it was warmer than the Tuesday had been, and because sitting indoors felt like an intimacy she was not prepared to offer, and because there was something about the open air and the sounds of the street that made everything feel like it could be taken back if necessary. "Sit," she said. "I made coffee. She hadn't meant to make coffee. She had meant to simply sit and conduct a conversation and send him away with some polite finality, because she had spent 2 days convincing herself that the Tuesday conversation had been a momentary lapse in judgment and not under any circumstances the beginning of something. But she had made coffee. She brought 2 cups and sat in her chair and watched him wrap both hands around the cup, the way men did when they had spent too many mornings working in the cold. "How long have you been at the Granger Ranch?" she asked, because it was a neutral question, a practical question, the kind of question that didn't mean anything. 3 weeks now," he said. "Granger had some fence work and needed extra hands. I'm through the worst of it. And then I ride out to Bridger Valley and see about the land." "You said you'd had your eye on a piece." "Yes, ma'am. Been in contact with the man who holds it. He's willing to sell if the price is right. I've been saving a long time." Something in his voice changed slightly. Not pride exactly, but the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has worked very hard for something and is close enough to touch it. "It's good land. Creek runs through the south end. Good grass on the north slope." "What do you know about running a ranch?" Emma asked. "Everything," he said simply. "I've spent 15 years learning on other men's operations. I know cattle and I know horses and I know what the land needs and what it doesn't. I know how to fix what breaks and when to ask for help fixing what I can't." He looked at her. "I'm not young, Miss Whitmore. I don't have illusions about what hard work looks like. I know exactly what I'm walking into." "Most men who say that don't," Emma said. "Most men who say that haven't done what I've done." He said it without arrogance, simply as fact. "I've worked through 3 droughts and a flood and 2 winters that killed cattle and 2 that killed men. I know what the West costs." Emma looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You're not afraid of it," she said. "No, ma'am." A pause. "Are you?" She considered the question. "I was," she said. "When I first came. I didn't know anyone here. I didn't know if the shop would work. I didn't know if I could make enough to eat through the first winter." She looked out at the street. "I was terrified every single day for 2 years." "What changed?" "It stopped failing," she said. "Once something stops failing, the fear becomes something else. It becomes—" She searched for the word. "Vigilance. You stop being afraid of the same things, and you start being afraid of different things." "What are you afraid of now?" he asked. It was a direct question. A surprisingly direct question. Emma glanced at him sharply, expecting she wasn't sure what. Calculation, perhaps. The strategic deployment of intimacy. But his face was just open. Curious. The way someone looks when they ask a question because they want to know the answer, rather than because they want to use it. "That's a personal question, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "You don't have to answer it." She almost didn't. "I'm afraid," she said very carefully, looking at the street, rather than at him, "of building something and having it taken away." He was quiet for a moment. "The shop," he said. She didn't answer. Which was itself an answer. They sat in silence for a moment that should have been uncomfortable and somehow wasn't. "I'm not going to tell you I understand what you went through," Caleb said. "Abigail didn't tell me the details and I wouldn't—" He paused. "It's not my story to know unless you decide to tell it. But I understand what it is to build something with your own hands and have someone walk in and treat it like it's theirs." His voice had gone quieter. "I had a partner once, on a small operation out in Kansas. I put in 4 years and most of my savings. He sold the land out from under me while I was out driving cattle." He said it plainly, but Emma heard the long-healed scar underneath the plainness. "I had to start over." Emma looked at him then. "How old were you?" 27. "What did you do?" "I was angry for about a month," he said. "Then I got back to work." Something that might have been the ghost of a rueful smile. "Didn't have a lot of other options." Emma thought about herself at 27, standing outside a house that had once been hers, holding a suitcase and 43 cents, and the particular cold fury of a woman who has discovered she has been systematically deceived, and feeling underneath the fury something very close to relief, because at least now she knew. At least now she didn't have to wonder anymore. "People keep telling me I should have remarried," she said. "People tell you a lot of things, I expect," Caleb said. "They do." She set down her cup. "They tell me I'm too particular, too independent, that I've made it too easy to be alone." She said it without bitterness, simply as the catalogue of opinions she had accumulated. "Mrs. Haverford at the dry goods store tells me at least once a month that a woman my age ought to have someone. What do you say to her?" Emma looked at him steadily. "I thank her for her concern, and I change the subject." The corner of his mouth did the almost smile thing again. "That's a skill," he said. "It is," Emma agreed. "I've had a great deal of practice." They sat on her porch as the evening settled fully into dark, and the street quieted, and the oil lamps in the boarding house windows down the way cast their yellow light across the dust, and Emma Whitmore, who had built every wall between herself and the rest of the world with careful and deliberate precision, found herself still sitting there when the coffee was long cold, talking to a stranger who was. She was beginning to understand not quite a stranger anymore. She didn't know what to do with that. She almost said so. Instead, she stood and collected the cups and told him it was getting late. He stood and put his hat on and said goodnight. He walked down the steps. He had reached the street when she said despite herself, despite everything, "Same time Tuesday if you're still in town?" Caleb Mercer stopped walking. He turned back, and in the lamplight from her window, Emma could not read his expression precisely, but she had the impression it was something careful and genuine, and entirely without triumph. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll be here." He walked away into the dark street, and Emma stood holding 2 cold coffee cups and understanding with a clarity she found more frightening than anything that had happened to her in years. That whatever she had told herself about the nature of this arrangement, she had just made it into something else. She didn't know yet what that something else was. She knew it frightened her. She went inside, washed the cups, climbed the stairs, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the October wind move through the cottonwoods. She did not examine what she was feeling. She was very practiced at not doing that. But somewhere in the walls she had built in the careful architecture of her solitude, something had shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Like the first hairline fracture in stone. She would have to be careful. She would have to be very, very careful. But she lay in the dark above her shop, and thought about a man who had listened more than he had spoken, who had sat on her porch without trying to claim any part of it, who had answered her questions without flinching, and had not even once told her what she should be. She thought about a question he had asked. "What are you afraid of now?" And she thought in the honest dark before sleep about the answer she hadn't given. This, she thought. "I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of a door that I might actually want to open." He came on Tuesday, same as he promised. Emma had told herself she wouldn't watch for him. She had told herself this with great conviction, while she stood at her front window 3 separate times between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. And each time she stepped away from the window, she felt the particular irritation of a woman catching herself doing exactly what she said she wouldn't do. He knocked at 6 exactly. She waited 4 seconds before opening the door, because opening it immediately would have said something she wasn't prepared to say. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Whitmore." Hat in hands, same as always. She had made coffee again. She noticed that he noticed, and that he didn't comment on it, and she appreciated that more than she expected to. They sat on the porch, and she asked him about the Granger fence work, and he told her it was finished, and she asked him what came next, and he said he was riding out to Bridger Valley Thursday to look at the land again, and something about the way he said it quietly, with the kind of concentrated attention a man gives to a thing he has wanted for a very long time, made Emma feel something she immediately decided not to examine. "Tell me about it," she said instead. He looked at her. "The land." "The land," she said. "Tell me what you see when you think about it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who didn't have an answer, but the quiet of a man who was deciding whether to give the real one or a safer version. He gave the real one. "I see a house," he said. "Not a big one. Something built right, something that'll last. A barn that doesn't leak. Pasture fenced properly, not just held together with prayer and rusted wire." A pause. "I see mornings where I'm working something that's mine. Where every fence post I drive and every calf I pull through winter and every hard season I survive, I'm surviving it for something that has my name on it." He looked at the street. "I've worked a long time for other men. Good men mostly. But it's not the same. You can pour yourself into another man's land, and at the end of it, it's still his land." Emma understood that. She understood it with the precise and bone-deep comprehension of someone who had built something that was entirely hers, and knew exactly what that cost, and exactly what it was worth. "No," she said quietly. "It's not the same." He glanced at her. Something shifted in his expression, a small recognition, the look of a person who has said something true and found it unexpectedly received. They were quiet for a moment. "What does the valley look like?" Emma asked. "Open," he said. "Wide. The creek cuts through the south end, and there's cottonwoods along it, and in the fall they go yellow all at once like someone lit them." He paused. "The north slope is grass, good grass, the kind that comes back after hard winters. The sellers run cattle on it for 20 years, and the land isn't tired. That's rare." "You've looked at a lot of land that's tired," Emma said. Too much, he said. Men who take everything out of it and put nothing back. Who see land as something to use up rather than something to tend. There was something very steady in his voice when he said it, something that went beyond opinion into conviction. Land's not different from anything else worth keeping. You have to give it what it needs. Emma set down her cup. She didn't know why she said what she said next. She hadn't planned to say it. She had, in fact, specifically decided not to say anything like it. I had a garden, she said, in Ohio. Caleb looked at her and said nothing, which was exactly the right response. My husband thought gardens were a waste of time, she continued. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. He thought anything that didn't produce immediate income was a waste of time. The garden, the books I kept on the shelf, the hour I took on Sunday mornings to sit on the back step before he woke up. She paused. He had a great many opinions about how time should be spent. Did the garden grow? Caleb asked. It was such a simple question. Such an unexpected question. She had been braced for sympathy, or for the careful diplomatic silence that people offered when they didn't know how to respond to the outline of a bad marriage, and instead he had asked about the garden. It did, she said, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Better than anything else on the property. I had tomatoes that summer that were... She stopped. The memory was so specific and so small and so vivid that it surprised her. They were extraordinary. I gave half of them away to the neighbors because we couldn't eat them fast enough. And he still thought it was a waste of time, Caleb said. Not a question. He did not eat the tomatoes, Emma said. On principle. Caleb looked at her. And then, to Emma's considerable surprise, he laughed a short, genuine sound, not mocking, or performed just a real laugh at the real absurdity of a man refusing tomatoes on principle. Emma felt the corner of her own mouth move before she could stop it. It sounds funny, she said. Now. It sounds like a man who was more concerned with being right than being fed, Caleb said. Yes, Emma said. That describes him very accurately. She had not talked about her first husband to anyone in Willow Creek. She had not talked about him to anyone at all in years, because talking about him required reaching into a place she had sealed shut for very practical reasons, and she had never found sufficient cause to unseal it. The people who asked about her past were generally asking because they wanted to understand her reluctance to marry again, and she had no interest in explaining herself to people who had already decided what she should be doing. But this man had asked about the garden. He had asked whether it grew, and somehow that small question had opened a door she'd kept shut for 7 years, and through it had come a memory of red tomatoes in hot Ohio sun, and the particular fierce satisfaction of growing something beautiful in spite of everything, and she found she did not immediately want to close it again. That frightened her. She stood up and collected the cups. It's getting late, she said. Caleb stood without protest, without negotiation, without the particular male maneuver of suddenly finding more things to say when a woman indicated the conversation was over. He simply stood. Thursday I ride out to the valley, he said. I'll be back by Saturday. You don't need to report back to me, Mr. Mercer, Emma said. No, he agreed. I don't. He put his hat on. Good night, Miss Whitmore. I was at the bottom of the steps when she said, despite everything for the second time in a week, I hope the land is everything you think it is. He stopped. He turned back, and the lamplight caught the lines of his face, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and surprise, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. Thank you, he said quietly. That means something. He walked away into the dark. Emma went inside and washed the cups and climbed the stairs and lay awake again, which was becoming a pattern she did not appreciate, and thought about tomatoes and tired land, and a man who laughed at the right moment and asked the right questions, and stood up without argument when she said it was time to go. She thought, this is how it starts. She thought, I know how this goes. She thought, I am not going to let this happen. And then she lay awake for another 2 hours, thinking about the specific yellow of cottonwood trees in a valley she had never seen. She was not in any danger of anything. She was absolutely certain of that. Caleb came back on Saturday, same as he said. He knocked, and she opened the door, and his face had something new in it, a brightness underneath the tired lines, something that had been lit from the inside since she'd last seen him. "It's everything," he said without preamble. Emma looked at him. "The land," he said. "It's everything I thought it was. The grass on the north slope, the creek. There's a bend in it, south side, where it pools up clean water. I've never seen water that clear so late in the season." He caught himself. Seemed to hear what he was doing, talking about land to a woman on her porch, like a man who had no filter between his excitement and his mouth. "I apologize," he said. "I don't mean to." "Don't apologize," Emma said, and surprised herself by meaning it. "Come in." She had not invited him inside before. She saw the moment he registered it, a small stillness, a careful lack of reaction, as though he was afraid that if he responded to the invitation with anything other than calm acceptance, she would take it back. He came in. He sat in the chair at the work table that she indicated, and she made tea, because the evening was cold and because making tea gave her something to do with her hands, while she recalibrated the terms of whatever this was. Her shop at night was a particular kind of place. The bolts of fabric lined up along the walls caught the lamplight in different ways. The silks held it glowing softly. The woolens absorbed it. The cotton in the middle distance was the ordinary warm brown of a practical life. Her work table was spread with a half-finished skirt for the mayor's wife pinned precisely the white chalk marks visible on the dark blue wool. Caleb looked around the shop with the same focused attention he'd given everything else. Not the distracted glance of a man waiting to talk about himself, but the genuine look of someone actually taking something in. "You built all of this," he said. "I did," Emma said from the small kitchen alcove at the back. "How long did it take?" "The shop 2 years before it turned a real profit. 3 before I stopped calculating every purchase against what it would cost me if the month came up short." She came back with 2 cups and set them down and sat across from him. "The first winter, I ate a great deal of beans." "I've had winters like that," he said. "I expect you have." She looked at him across the work table, across the half-finished skirt, and the chalk marks, and the accumulated evidence of 7 years of making herself into exactly what she needed to be, and felt the peculiar doubled vision of a woman who sees clearly both the danger of a thing and the pull of it simultaneously. "Tell me about the house," she said. "What you're planning." He did. How as a precise planner, she discovered. He talked about the house the way she talked about a complex dress in terms of structure and materials, and the logic of how one thing supported another. He'd been thinking about it for years, he said. He knew what he wanted the kitchen to face, and why. He knew what the barn needed to be able to hold. He knew where the water would run in a wet spring, and how to build so it ran away from the foundations rather than through them. And then he said something that made Emma set down her cup. "I was thinking about the south side of the house," he said. "The light's good there morning through midday. I was thinking a room on the south side with good windows." He paused, almost carefully. Good light for whatever someone might need it for. Work that needed good light. Emma looked at him very steadily. "Work," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Like sewing," she said. Something moved through his expression, not quite a flinch, but close. "Like sewing," he said. "Or whatever else a person might need the light for. It was just a thought." Emma was quiet for a long moment. She was very practiced at seeing men's strategies. She had survived 7 years in a frontier town, partly by being very good at understanding what was underneath what men said. She had learned to read the calculation behind the courtesy, the ownership underneath the admiration. She looked at Caleb Mercer. She looked for the strategy. She looked for the moment where the room with good southern light became a trap. She couldn't find it, which frightened her more than finding it would have. "That's a considerable thing to plan," she said, "for a man who isn't sure what his future looks like." "I've always planned for the future I wanted," he said, "not the one I was guaranteed." "And what future do you want, Mr. Mercer?" He met her eyes. "One where I'm not alone," he said. "That's the honest answer. I've been alone a long time, and I'm good at it the same as you're good at it. But good at something and wanting to keep doing it aren't always the same thing." Emma said nothing. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight," he said. I'm not asking you for anything at all, except maybe the chance to keep having this conversation, that's all. Emma looked at the half-finished skirt on her table. At the precise chalk marks she'd made by hand, the careful lines that would become something beautiful and functional, and made to fit a specific person in a specific life. She thought about what it had cost her to make this shop into what it was. She thought about the tomatoes in Ohio growing beautifully in spite of everything. She thought about a room with good southern light. "Same time Tuesday," she said. Caleb Mercer nodded very carefully, as though he knew that the careful thing was the right thing. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He left. Emma sat alone at her work table for a long time after, in the lamplight with the half-finished skirt and the chalk marks and the bolts of fabric watching her from the walls. She picked up her needle. She worked until midnight. She did not think about anything, which was itself a kind of thinking. It was Mrs. Haverford who made the first comment. Emma had expected it. She had expected it from the moment Caleb had started appearing at her porch in the evenings, because Willow Creek was a small town, and small towns had their own ecology and gossip moved through them, the way water moved through sand, quietly, quickly, and into every available space. She was in the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning, buying buttons, when Mrs. Haverford placed her elbows on the counter with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment. "I hear you've had company," Mrs. Haverford said. "I have customers regularly," Emma said. "It is a shop. Evening company." Mrs. Haverford clarified with the cheerful precision of someone who has watched a town for 30 years and considers everyone in it her personal business. "On the porch. A gentleman, I'm told." "I've had a friend visit," Emma said. She was very careful with the word. "Is there something wrong with having friends, Mrs. Haverford?" "Not at all, dear. Not at all." Mrs. Haverford counted out the buttons with exaggerated attention. "He's a ranch worker, I understand. Came from the east." "He's looking at land in Bridger Valley," Emma said. She didn't know why she said it. She had not meant to offer any information at all. Mrs. Haverford's eyes brightened. "Is he?" she said. "Well, a man looking to settle. That's something." "It's his own business," Emma said. "Of course it is." Mrs. Haverford agreed with the tone of a woman who believed no such thing. "You know, Emma, I've said for years that you work too hard." "I work appropriately," Emma said. "You work too hard," Mrs. Haverford repeated with the gentle implacability of someone who has decided she is right, "and you don't let anyone near enough to help you. And there's nothing wrong with letting someone near." Emma took her buttons and her change and left the store. She walked back to the shop with the cool October air against her face, and the buttons rattling in their paper bag, and the awareness that the conversation with Mrs. Haverford was only the first of its kind, and that the ones to come would be increasingly pointed. She was right. By the following week, she had received 2 more observations from well-meaning acquaintances. One pointed comment from Ruth Harker at the millinery, who had never forgiven Emma for declining to join the ladies' social committee, and used every available opportunity to suggest that Emma's independence was a form of pride rather than practicality, and a letter from her sister Abigail that arrived on Thursday afternoon, and which Emma almost put away unread. She didn't. She stood at her work table and opened it. My dear Emma, Abigail had written in the rounded, careful script she'd had since childhood. "I am torturing myself with wondering whether I did the right thing. Caleb is a good man. I believe that absolutely, but I know you, and I know that what you will never forgive is someone making a choice that belongs to you. I should have asked. I know I should have asked. The truth is, I was afraid you'd say no without thinking about it, and I couldn't bear that. Not because I think you need a husband you've proven 100 times over that you don't need anyone, but because I see in your letters between all the words about fabrics and orders and weather how quiet your life has become. Not peaceful. Quiet. There is a difference, and I think you know it. I love you. I'm sorry. Whatever you decide, I'm on your side. Always." Emma read it twice. She folded it very precisely and put it in the drawer of her work table, the drawer where she kept things she wasn't ready to throw away and wasn't ready to look at. She stood for a moment with her hand on the drawer. Abigail knew her. Abigail had always known her. They had grown up together. The Whitmore sisters, Emma, older and louder and more stubborn. Abigail, younger and quieter, and in possession of the particular intelligence that presents itself as patience. Abigail had written quiet in the letter, not lonely. And Emma noticed that, and hated that she noticed it, because it suggested her sister had chosen the word deliberately, which meant her sister understood something that Emma was still insisting wasn't true. She went back to work. The rest of that week passed in the ordinary business of the shop: 2 new dress orders, an alteration on a coat, a girl from the edge of town who needed a hem let down because she'd grown 3 inches since spring and couldn't afford new. Emma fitted the girl and let out the hem and charged her half what she usually would and told her it was a standing discount for growing young women, which she invented on the spot and which made the girl go pink with relief. She was good at her work. She knew she was good at it. It was one of the things she had allowed herself to be certain of in the years of not being certain of very much. Tuesday came around and Caleb knocked at 6, and she opened the door, and this time she said without preamble, "My sister sent me a letter." He looked at her. "Apologizing," Emma said. "She said she should have asked before sending you." "She should have," Caleb said. "She also said she was afraid I'd say no without thinking about it." Something careful moved through his expression. "Would you have?" he asked. Emma looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, immediately and without hesitation. "And now?" She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "It's cold." He came in. They sat at the work table again, and she made tea again, and this time the conversation moved differently, less careful, less measured, less like 2 people deciding whether to trust each other, and more like 2 people who had already somewhere in the past few weeks, without fully acknowledging it, made that decision. He told her about a winter in Wyoming. He'd nearly not survived a blizzard that came in 3 days before anyone expected it, and how he and 2 other hands had sheltered in a line shack for 9 days on half rations and not gone out until the storm cleared. He told it matter-of-factly, the way you tell a story when you've made your peace with the fear that was in it. And Emma listened and thought about what it meant to have made your peace with fear, and whether she had, and about which of her fears she was still carrying around as though they were current when they were really just memories of a danger that had already passed. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," he said immediately, without the defensive deflection that most men offered when asked that kind of question. "On the 3rd day I was genuinely not sure we were going to get out." "What did you do?" "Kept moving," he said. "You can't stop moving in cold like that. You keep moving, and you keep thinking, and you don't let yourself believe it's over until the storm breaks." He looked at his cup. "The storm always breaks." Emma thought about standing outside a locked house in Ohio at 23 years old, with a suitcase and 43 cents, and the absolute conviction that she did not know how to survive what had just happened to her. The storm always breaks. She hadn't thought of it in those terms before. She had thought of it as surviving, as proving, as building herself into something so self-sufficient that no one could ever lock her out of her own life again. But it had also simply been waiting for the storm to break. And it had. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Caleb, he said. "If you're willing." She paused. "Caleb," she said, and the name sat differently in her mouth than the formality had, and she saw him register that and watched him carefully not react to it. "There are people in this town who have opinions about the time we've been spending together," she said. "I expect there are," he said. "It doesn't concern you." "My concern is what you think," he said, "not what Willow Creek thinks." "What I think," Emma said, "is that I am not prepared to be someone's object of charity or someone's social project, and if that's what this is—" "It's not," he said. "Let me finish." He stopped. "If that's what this is," she said, "I need you to tell me now, because I have spent 7 years building a life that belongs entirely to me, and I will not have it whispered about and speculated over by people who already think I'm peculiar for not wanting what they want. If you are here because Abigail asked you to be here, and you felt obligated, and you are staying because you feel guilty about leaving." "I'm staying," Caleb said very quietly, "because I want to be here." The words landed with a simplicity that was more effective than any elaborate declaration. Emma stopped. "I came because Abigail asked," he said. "I stayed because of you. Those are different things." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not here out of obligation. I don't do things out of obligation. I'm too old and too tired to spend my time on things I don't mean." He paused. "You can tell me to leave and I'll go without argument. But if I stay, it's because I want to. And you can trust that or you can't, but it's the truth." Emma sat very still. She had been hit with elaborate declarations before. Her first husband had been extraordinarily skilled at elaborate declarations. He had declared his love for her in terms that would have made a poet envious, and every single one of those beautiful words had been architecture carefully built to obscure what was underneath. This man did not use beautiful words. He used plain ones, and she found to her own considerable alarm that she believed him. She looked down at her hands on the work table. "I don't know how to do this," she said very quietly. Not to him exactly. To the air, to the lamplight, to the bolts of fabric that had been her only company for 7 years. "I knew how to do it once. I was very young and very stupid and very certain, and I know how that went. And I rebuilt myself into someone who didn't need to know how to do it, and that worked. That served me very well." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not a woman who can pretend she doesn't have a past. I can't start over as though none of it happened. I'm not that person, and I wouldn't trust her if I were." "I'm not asking you to be," he said. "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression he was being very careful that he understood the weight of what was being asked and was not going to give her something careless. "I'm asking," he said, "if you'd let me prove I'm not him." The sentence was so simple, so devastatingly simple. Emma felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long. She almost didn't know what it was. Something that wasn't longing exactly, and wasn't hope exactly, but was the particular terrifying warmth of a door that had been shut for years, beginning barely cautiously to open an inch. She didn't say anything. She couldn't say anything. But she did not say no. And in the silence that followed, Caleb Mercer sat across her work table and waited. The way he always waited, patiently, without pressure, without filling the space with things she hadn't asked for. Outside, the wind moved through Willow Creek. Somewhere a door closed. The lamplight held them in its small, warm circle. And Emma Whitmore, who had built every wall she owned with her own 2 hands, sat very still and felt the first one begin to crack. Not collapse, not fall, just crack. Just enough. She looked up. He was still there. He met her eyes and said nothing at all, and it was the nothing, the steady, unhurried, unclaiming nothing, that finally made her say, in a voice that was quieter than she intended, "I need more time." "You can have it," he said immediately. "All of it. I'm not promising anything. I know. This might go nowhere. I know that too." Emma looked at him across the work table, across the chalk marks and the half-finished things and the evidence of the life she had built, and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this man was going to be very hard to dismiss. Not because he was charming, not because he was handsome, but because he kept showing up with his hat in his hands, and he kept answering her honestly, and he kept sitting down without claiming any part of the space, and somehow, in the accumulation of those simple things, he had become the most dangerous kind of person. The kind it was possible to trust. "Same time Thursday," she said. It was not a concession. It was not a surrender. It was just a woman who had been very alone for a very long time, choosing with great caution and no guarantees, and both eyes fully open to leave the door open a crack. Caleb Mercer stood and put on his hat and said goodnight. He walked out into the dark. And Emma sat alone at her work table with her needle and her chalk marks, and the quiet that had been her home for 7 years, and felt against her will, and past every wall, and with the terrifying clarity of someone who knows exactly what it means that it was not quite as quiet as it used to be. The Thursday after that conversation, Caleb didn't come alone. Emma heard the knock at 6 and opened the door, expecting the familiar sight of one tired man with his hat in his hands, and found instead Caleb standing beside a woman she had never seen, small, somewhere in her 60s, with the kind of face that had been beautiful once and had aged into something more interesting than beauty. She was looking at Emma with an expression that was warm and direct, and entirely without apology. "Miss Whitmore," Caleb said, and his voice carried something careful in it, something that told Emma this had not been planned without considerable thought. "This is Margaret Granger. She owns the ranch where I've been working. She asked if she could come. I told her it was your decision whether to let her in." Emma looked at Margaret Granger. Margaret Granger looked back at her with the calm of a woman who had outlasted a great many things and knew it. "I told him I'd wait on the street if you preferred," Margaret said. "I'm not here to impose. I heard about you from my husband for 3 years before I met you, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman builds a dress shop from 43 cents in a bad marriage." She paused. "He talks about you, you know. Caleb does. More than he thinks he does." Emma looked at Caleb. Caleb had the expression of a man who was sincerely regretting certain life choices. Emma stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Both of you." She made coffee. She made it stronger than usual because she had the feeling she was going to need it, and she set out 3 cups at the work table and sat down and looked at Margaret Granger, who had settled herself into a chair with the ease of a woman completely comfortable in rooms that weren't hers. "What did you want to see?" Emma asked. "Whether you were afraid of him," Margaret said. Emma blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Caleb's a good man," Margaret said without preamble, without decoration. "I've known him 4 years. I know what he's made of. What I wanted to see was whether you were going to let that matter, or whether you were going to keep him at arm's length until he gave up and left." She picked up her coffee cup. "I've seen it before. Good men and women who've been hurt so badly they can't recognize good when it's standing on their porch." Emma felt something sharp move through her. Not offense exactly, but the particular sting of hearing something uncomfortably accurate said, without any attempt to soften it. "Mrs. Granger," she said very evenly, "I don't believe we know each other well enough for that kind of observation." "No," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "We don't. That's why I'm making it now before we spend 6 months being polite and I lose the chance." She set down her cup. "I'm not saying you owe this man anything. I'm not saying you should do anything you don't want to do. I'm saying that watching you from across a table, you don't look afraid of him." She paused. "You look afraid of yourself." The silence that followed was the loudest Emma had heard in a long time. Caleb, she noticed, was looking at the wall, studiously, with the focused attention of a man pretending he was elsewhere. Emma looked at Margaret Granger, who looked back at her without flinching, without apology, with the absolute steadiness of a woman who had decided honesty was worth the risk. Emma thought about 7 years of mornings alone above the shop. She thought about letters from Abigail with careful worried words between the lines. She thought about the drawer in her work table, where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at, and about the crack in the wall she'd felt 2 weeks ago, and about the fact that she had since that evening been increasingly failing to pretend the crack wasn't there. "That's a very direct thing to say," Emma said. "I'm a very direct woman," Margaret said. "We're in short supply out here, and I don't apologize for it." Something pulled at the corner of Emma's mouth before she could stop it. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you do." They sat at the work table for 2 hours that night, the 3 of them. Margaret Granger told stories about the ranch and the land, and the first winter she and her husband had spent in the West, which had apparently involved a collapsed roof, 2 sick horses, and a season of hardship that should by rights have broken them, and hadn't. She talked about what it meant to build something in country that fought you every step, and what it meant to do it with someone who thought you were capable of the fight. She talked about her husband with the quiet, particular love of someone who has been married long enough to be past illusions and into something realer and more durable. And Emma listened and felt with increasing discomfort the growing sense that she was being shown something on purpose. Not manipulated. Shown. There was a difference, and she knew it. When Margaret left standing and pulling on her coat with the brisk efficiency of a woman who never lingered past her welcome, she paused at the door and looked back at Emma. "He planned the South Room before he ever heard your name," she said. "He told me about it in June, 4 months before Abigail wrote to us about you. He'd been planning it for years." She held Emma's gaze. "I thought you should know that." She left. Emma stood in the doorway of her shop and listened to the sound of Margaret Granger's footsteps fading down the street, and then turned to look at Caleb, who was still sitting at the work table looking at the wall. "You knew she was going to say that," Emma said. "I did not know she was going to say any of that," Caleb said with great feeling. "Margaret does what Margaret does, and I have learned not to make predictions." "The South Room," Emma said. He looked at her then. "I told you," he said. "I planned for the future I wanted, not the one I was guaranteed. You planned a sewing room before you knew there would be anyone to use it. I planned a room with good light," he said carefully, "for whatever it turned out to be needed for." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "That is either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "or the most elegant piece of planning I have ever encountered." "I think it's probably both," Caleb said, with what might have been the beginnings of a real smile. Emma sat back down at the work table. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to listen without commenting until I'm done." "All right," he said. She told him about Ohio. Not everything. She was not ready for everything, and she suspected she would never be entirely ready for everything. Because some things don't need to be excavated from where they've settled, they need to be left there where they've stopped hurting. But she told him the shape of it. She told him about a man who had charmed her when she was 22 and married her at 23, and spent the next 3 years systematically dismantling her, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who understands that the most effective kind of control is the kind that makes you doubt yourself before you think to doubt them. She told him about the garden. She told him about being locked out. She told him about 43 cents and a worn suitcase, and the road west that she'd taken not because she knew where she was going, but because she could not stay where she was, and about arriving in Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning in March, when the town was half frozen and half awake, and not even fully a town yet, and about walking into the space that would become her shop, and standing in the empty cold room, and deciding with the absolute ferocity of someone who has run out of other options that this was going to become something. She told him all of that. She told it plainly, without self-pity, without drama, in the even voice she had developed for talking about hard things. She told it the way you tell a thing when you've survived it long enough to see the whole shape of it. And Caleb sat across the work table from her and listened, and he did not say a word until she was done. And when she was done, he sat for a moment in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of the weight of what he'd been given, and the understanding of what it cost to give it. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me. Not I'm sorry. Not that must have been terrible. Not the careful diplomatic expressions that people offered when they didn't know what to do with someone else's pain. Just thank you for telling me." Emma looked at him. "That's all you're going to say," she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to say that whoever he was wrong. Not just about you. He was wrong about what a person is for." He said it very quietly. "People are not for managing. They're not—" He stopped, seemed to be finding the right words. "They're not projects. You don't take someone with a garden and a shelf of books and an hour of Sunday morning peace and decide those things need to be controlled. You just don't." Emma said nothing. "And I want to be very clear," he said, "that I am not telling you this because I want you to feel better or because I want you to trust me. I'm telling you because it's true, and because you've been carrying that man's verdict around for 7 years, and his verdict was wrong." The lamp between them flickered very slightly in a draft from somewhere. Emma felt something in her chest that she recognized now for what it was. Not hope, not attraction. Something older and deeper than those things. Something she had believed for a long time that she had successfully cauterized. She was wrong. She looked at her hands on the work table. "I need to close up," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He stood. He put on his hat. He was at the door when she said, "Caleb." He stopped. She looked at him. "The South Room," she said. "What size were you thinking?" He held very still. "Big enough for 2 machines," he said. "And a cutting table." Emma nodded once precisely. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Emma," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and she had not told him to, and she noticed that, and she did not correct it. He left. She stood alone in her shop for a long time after. Then she went to the drawer in her work table and took out Abigail's letter and read it one more time. The part that said quiet, and thought about the difference between peaceful and quiet, and decided that she had known the difference all along and had simply been refusing to admit it. She put the letter in her apron pocket instead of back in the drawer. That was the first week of November. By the second week of November, things had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that made a good story for someone watching from outside, but in the small, specific ways that matter more than dramatic ones, the ways that accumulate into something different than what existed before. Caleb started leaving things at the shop. Not large things, not conspicuous things, not the kinds of gifts that announce themselves and require acknowledgement. Small things. A length of good cord she'd mentioned needing. A specific kind of button she'd been waiting on from the catalog. He'd found a supply store in the next town, and bought them without saying anything, and left them on the porch with no note. Fresh eggs from the Granger henhouse left in a basket on a Tuesday morning before she was even open because he'd been riding past at dawn and stopped. She did not thank him each time. He did not expect her to. She was discovering extraordinarily good at doing things without requiring acknowledgement, which was unusual enough in a person, not just a man, but any person that she kept noticing it. On the third Saturday of November, she was carrying a crate of fabric from the freight wagon to the shop when he appeared beside her and took the other end without asking. She almost told him she could manage it. She stopped herself. She looked at his hands on the crate and thought, "This is not a man trying to take something from me. This is a man carrying a box." She let him carry the box. They set it down inside together, and he straightened up, and she said, surprising herself, "There's coffee if you want it." He sat at the work table while she sorted fabric and they talked. Not about the future, not about Ohio, not about anything that required navigation. They talked about the town, about the wagon road north that had been in poor repair since spring, about a family new to Willow Creek who'd come from Kansas and needed a lot of practical information about the winters here. Emma had made the mother a coat reduced price, she'd need it, and Caleb had helped the father figure out what the barn needed before the cold set in hard. It was domestic, the conversation, small and ordinary and real. Emma noticed halfway through that she was not monitoring his words for danger. She was just talking. She could not remember the last time she had just talked. It was Mrs. Ruth Harker who broke the peace. Emma should have expected it. Ruth Harker had been building towards something for weeks. Emma had seen it in the way the woman's eyes followed her at church in the pointed silences. When Emma walked past the millinery, in the way she arranged her face into expressions of concern, so elaborate they could only mean one thing. It happened on a Wednesday morning outside the general store, in front of 4 other women and one man who had the misfortune of walking by at the wrong moment. "Emma," Ruth said in the voice she used for announcements she dressed up as conversation. "I wanted to say, and I say this as someone who has always been concerned for you, I think it's wonderful that you've found company. Though of course some people are wondering." Emma stopped walking. She knew she should keep walking. She stopped anyway. "Wondering what, Ruth?" she said. "Well?" Ruth adjusted her expression into one of exquisite delicacy. "A woman alone running a business, and now spending so much time with a man nobody in this town really knows. A ranch worker. It's just people wonder what kind of arrangement." "Ruth," Emma said. Ruth stopped. "I'm going to stop you right there," Emma said. Her voice was very even. She had long ago learned that the most effective way to say a hard thing was to say it quietly. "I'm not going to discuss what kind of arrangement I do or do not have with anyone, because it is no one's business but mine. What I will say is this: if you have something specific to say it plainly, and I'll respond plainly. But if what you're doing is implying something in language careful enough that you can deny it later, I am not going to stand here and pretend I don't understand what you're doing." Ruth Harker's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. One of the other women, Clara Booth, who ran the laundry, and who Emma had always quietly respected, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "I only meant," Ruth began. "I know what you meant," Emma said. "Good morning, Ruth." She walked away. She kept her pace even and her chin up, and she did not look back, and she did not let the shaking in her hands show until she was inside the shop with the door closed behind her and no one watching. She stood in the back room for 2 full minutes breathing carefully. She was not afraid. She was furious. Not at Ruth Harker. Not really. Ruth Harker was simply the most visible symptom of a thing that Emma had been fighting since the day she arrived in this town alone and decided to build something. The assumption that a woman alone was a woman waiting. The assumption that independence was temporary transitional, a holding pattern between one man and the next. The assumption that whatever she was doing with her time and her money and her extraordinary competence was fine as a stopgap, but couldn't possibly be a destination. She was still standing there when the knock came at the back door. She opened it without thinking. Caleb stood there hat in hand with the look of a man who had heard something he hadn't been meant to hear. "How much of that did you see?" Emma asked. "Enough," he said. "And—" He looked at her for a moment. "And I think you handled it better than I would have," he said. Something released in her chest. "I'm not asking you to defend me," she said automatically, because it was what she always said when people offered to defend her. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm not here to defend you. I'm here because I was walking past and I saw and I wanted to make sure." He stopped, seemed to choose again. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." She looked at him. "I'm angry," she said. "That's all right," he said. "I'm angry at Ruth Harker, and I'm angry at the assumption, and I'm angry that 7 years of building something real and solid and mine has somehow still not been sufficient to make people stop treating me like I'm waiting to be completed by someone else." "That's all right too," he said. He said it simply without trying to fix it or redirect it or suggest that maybe she was being slightly unreasonable the way people sometimes did when a woman's anger made them uncomfortable. He just let her be angry. He stood in the doorway of her back room and let her be angry and said it was all right and waited. She looked at him. She thought, "I have never in my life had someone stand there and just let me be angry." She thought, "What do I do with a person like this?" "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in. They sat together in the back room while the town went on its business outside, and she was still angry. But it was the kind of anger that had somewhere to go now that wasn't sealed inside her, and she felt it move through her and settle and become something smaller and more manageable. "She's not the only one who thinks it," Emma said. "About the arrangement." "I know," Caleb said. "It doesn't bother you that people are talking." He thought about that honestly, which she appreciated. "What bothers me," he said, "is that they're talking about you. About your reputation and your choices and your right to do what you want with your own time. That bothers me considerably." He looked at her. "What they say about me is their business, and I don't much care." Ruth Harker implied. "Ruth Harker can imply whatever she wants," Caleb said very mildly. "My conscience is clear, and so is yours, and that is the only accounting that matters." Emma looked at him. "You believe that," she said, not a question. "I do," he said, "completely." She sat with that for a moment. "Most men would want to—" She stopped, started again. "Most men in your position would want to formalize things, to have an answer to give people." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I want what you're willing to give," he said. "I'm not going to push for more, because it would make a better answer for Ruth Harker." Emma set down her cup. She stood up. She walked to the small window in the back room and looked out at the alley and the back of the buildings across it, the ordinary, unremarkable back face of a frontier town going about its day. She thought about the conversation she'd had with herself every night for the past 3 weeks. The one where she explained with great patience and clarity all the reasons that this was a bad idea. The cost of trusting again. The efficiency of the life she'd built. The foolishness of wanting something she'd already proven she didn't need. She was so tired of that conversation. She was so tired of being right about things that made her feel like she was living inside a very well-constructed box. She turned around. "I want to see the land," she said. Caleb looked at her. "The Bridger Valley land," she said. "I want to see it." He was very still. "Emma, I'm not promising anything," she said immediately. "I want to be very clear. This is not a promise of anything. I would like to see the land you've been talking about, as someone interested in land, in general." The corner of his mouth did the thing she had come to look for without admitting it. "In general," he said. "Yes." "I could take you Saturday," he said. "If the weather holds." "If the weather holds," she said. He nodded. He stood and put his hat on and looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with the moments when something shifted, that careful, genuine, entirely untriumphant look. "Saturday, then," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. He left. Emma stood alone in the back room of her shop and pressed her hands against the work table and breathed in and breathed out and told herself very firmly that this was simply a practical matter of inspecting land and did not mean anything beyond that. She almost believed it. The week before Saturday was the longest of Emma's recent memory, which she resented because a long week implied anticipation, and she had specifically decided not to be anticipating anything. She was anticipating everything. She took 2 new dress orders and finished the mayor's wife's skirt and let out another hem for the girl from the edge of town who was apparently still growing, and all of it was fine and real and exactly what her life was, and she managed in the course of all that ordinary work to think about Saturday with the frequency and intensity of a woman who was absolutely not thinking about Saturday. On Friday afternoon, Margaret Granger came into the shop alone. Emma looked at her across the counter. "He doesn't know I'm here," Margaret said immediately. "I want that clear." "What do you want, Mrs. Granger?" Emma said. "I want to tell you one thing," Margaret said, "and then I'll buy some ribbon and go." Emma waited. 23 years ago," Margaret said. "A man named Douglas Granger came to my father's farm in Missouri and asked for permission to court me. My father said yes. I said nothing because nobody asked me." She paused. "I thought about saying no for 2 weeks, and then I married him because I couldn't think of a good enough reason not to, and because he was steady and honest and kind, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen." She held Emma's gaze. "That was the best decision I ever made. Not because I knew it would work out. I didn't know that. I decided because I was tired of being afraid of a good thing just because I'd seen bad ones." Emma said nothing. Margaret put a coin on the counter. "Half a yard of the brown ribbon, please," she said. Emma cut the ribbon. She handed it over. Margaret took it and walked to the door and stopped. "He plans carefully," she said without turning around. "Everything he does, he's thought it through. The South Room has been in his plans for 3 years. Not a room for a wife. A room for a person who needs good light." She opened the door. "That's the kind of man he is." She left. Emma stood at the counter with the scissors still in her hand. A room for a person who needs good light. Not a room for a wife. A room for a person. She set down the scissors. She went to the drawer in her work table and took out Abigail's letter, the one she'd been carrying in her apron pocket for 2 weeks, and she sat down and she read it again, and this time when she reached the word quiet, she didn't argue with it. She just sat with it. And she thought about Saturday, and about cottonwood trees going yellow all at once, and about a creek with water so clear you could see the bottom in late autumn, and about the terrifying, beautiful possibility of being fully herself and still being wanted. She folded the letter. She did not put it back in the drawer. She kept it in her pocket. Saturday came cold and bright, the sky, the particular hard blue of late November, the air with a bite in it that tasted like winter on its way, but not yet arrived. Caleb was at her door at 7, with 2 horses, which she had expected, and a pack with food for midday, which she hadn't, and the particular expression he wore when he was trying very hard not to look like a man who had planned things carefully. Emma looked at the pack. She looked at him. "You thought of food," she said. "It's a 4-hour ride," he said. "People get hungry." "In general," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "In general." She locked the shop behind her and swung up into the saddle, and they rode out of Willow Creek in the early morning cold, with the town still mostly sleeping behind them. And Emma felt something she had not felt in so long, it took her the first mile to identify it. She felt light. Not happy, not yet. She was too careful for Happy, too practiced at protecting herself from premature things. But light. As though she had set something down and hadn't noticed until it was gone. They rode through the morning talking easily, the way they had learned to talk without navigation, without strategy, without the careful monitoring of every word for danger. He told her about his horse, a gray named Dutch, who had opinions about mud and expressed them vocally. She told him about her first horse, a difficult roan mare she'd had in Ohio, who'd thrown her twice, and that she'd loved anyway. He laughed at that, the real laugh, not the polite one, and she found herself laughing too, and noticed it, and did not try to stop it. When they reached the valley, Emma understood immediately what he had been trying to tell her. She pulled her horse up at the ridge and looked down at it, and for a long moment she simply didn't speak. The creek ran through the south end exactly as he'd described. The cottonwoods along it were bare now, their branches silver against the blue sky, but she could imagine them in autumn yellow, exactly as he'd said, lit all at once, like something on fire. The north slope stretched broad and open, the grass pale and dry, but dense, the kind of grass that promised it knew what it was doing. The whole valley was cupped in low hills that broke the worst of the wind and held the light. It was not grand. It was not spectacular in the way of high mountains or vast plains. It was the kind of beautiful that was almost private, the kind you had to come close to see. She rode down the ridge into the valley without speaking. Caleb rode beside her and did not say a word. He let her look. He let her walk her horse along the creek and stand at the bend where the water pooled clear and cold and exactly as he'd described it. He let her ride the north slope and feel the ground under the horse's feet, the density of it, the realness of it. He let her take the full measure of the place at her own pace and in her own silence. And then when she pulled her horse up near the center of the valley and sat looking at the lay of it, he rode up beside her and stopped. She looked at the land. She thought about what it would cost to build a life in a place like this. She thought about what it had cost to build the life she had. She thought about a room with good southern light. And then she looked at the man beside her, at his profile against the winter sky, at the way he sat his horse with the easy stillness of someone who knew how to wait, and she felt with a clarity that was almost physical, the thing she had been refusing to feel for 2 months. It was not small. It was not manageable. It arrived with the particular force of something that has been kept behind a door for a very long time, and she sat with it on horseback in a valley she had never seen before, and felt it fill the space that 7 years of careful architecture had kept carefully empty. She was in love with this man. She did not say so. She was not ready to say so. But she looked at him, and he turned and looked at her, and whatever was in her face was enough, because something moved through his expression that she recognized, that she had seen before in the lamplight above the work table, that she understood now for what it was. He looked at her, the way you look at something you have been afraid to hope for. "Well," he said very quietly. Emma looked at the valley. She looked at him. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. "You should buy it," she said. He was very still. "Emma," he said. "You should buy it," she said again. "It's right. It's exactly what you said it was." She kept her voice steady. She was very practiced at steady. "And the house, when you build it, I want the south room to have 2 windows, not 1, 2. Caleb Mercer looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no word for. Something that was past hope, and past gratitude, and past any of the ordinary words. Something that lived in the place where a person arrives when a thing they stopped letting themselves want comes back to them. He said very quietly, 2 windows. "The light will be better," Emma said. "Yes," he said. "It will." They sat side by side on horseback in the cold, bright November morning, in a valley that would become something. And Emma Whitmore, who had protected herself with extraordinary skill for 7 years, who had built her walls so high and so strong that she had sometimes forgotten there was a door, felt the last of those walls go quiet, not fall, not crumble, just go quiet, like the end of a storm, like the particular silence that comes after something that has been loud for a very long time finally stops. She breathed it in. The cold air and the smell of dry grass and the sound of the creek running south. She was still herself. She was entirely, completely, irreversibly herself. And she was here. They rode back to Willow Creek in the afternoon light, and Emma did not speak much, and Caleb did not push her to. That was one of the things she had come to rely on without fully acknowledging it, his absolute ease with silence. He did not treat quiet as a problem to be solved. He let it sit between them like something comfortable, like a third companion who took up no space and asked for nothing. She was grateful for that because she needed the silence to hold what had happened in the valley. 2 windows. She had said 2 windows. She had said it as though it was a practical observation about light quality, and they had both known it was not, and neither of them had said so directly, and somehow that had been exactly right. She was still turning it over in her mind when they rode back into town, and he walked her horse to the post, and she climbed down, and he handed her the saddle pack with what was left of the midday food, and she took it, and they stood in front of her shop in the late afternoon cold and looked at each other. "Thank you," she said, "for taking me." "Thank you for coming," he said. She turned toward the door. "Emma." She stopped. She turned back. Howe was standing beside the horses with his hat in his hands, and his face had the expression she recognized now as Caleb Mercer, deciding to say a real thing. "I'm going to make an offer on the land Monday morning," he said. "I wanted you to know that. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're deciding, I'm not waiting on your answer to move forward. That land is what I want, and I'm going to buy it regardless." He paused. "I just wanted that clear. I'm not asking you to decide anything in order for me to do what I've been planning to do." Emma looked at him. She understood what he was giving her. He was removing the pressure. He was telling her plainly, and without drama, that his future did not depend on her choice, that she was not responsible for his plans, that she could take whatever time she needed without the weight of his dreams resting on her answer. It was, she thought, the most generous thing anyone had said to her in years. "I know," she said quietly. He nodded. He started to turn away. "Caleb." He stopped. She looked at him for a moment and thought about all the things she was not yet ready to say, and chose the one that was true and possible right now. "Buy the land," she said, "and build the house, and put 2 windows in the south room." She held his gaze. "I'll tell you the rest when I'm ready." Something happened in his face that he didn't try to hide. "All right," he said. "That's enough." He put his hat on and rode away, and Emma went inside and locked the door and stood in the middle of her shop in the gathering dark, and felt the full weight of where she was standing, not in the shop, but in her own life, at the exact point where the road she had been on for 7 years met a road she hadn't known was coming. She stood there for a long time. Then she went upstairs and wrote a letter to Abigail. She wrote it in one sitting, which was unusual. She normally wrote to Abigail the way she did everything, careful in stages with revision, with the deliberate editing out of anything that revealed too much. But that night, she wrote straight through, and what she wrote was this: that she had been to the Bridger Valley, that the land was real and right, and exactly what he'd described, that she had said something she hadn't planned to say, and meant every word of it, and that she was still frightened, but that the fear felt different now, less like a warning, and more like the feeling before you step off a ledge you've been standing on too long. She did not write, "I think I love him." She almost did. She sealed the letter instead. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she put it on the table to mail in the morning, and she went to bed, and she slept better than she had in 7 years. The offer on the land went through on Wednesday. Caleb told her on Thursday evening, sitting at the work table with coffee going cold between them and his voice. When he said it was the voice of a man who has been working toward something for so long that when it finally arrives, he almost doesn't know how to hold it. "It's done," he said. "Signed the papers this morning. It's mine." Emma looked at him. She set down her cup. She said, "Congratulations." 2 words. Quiet ones. But she said them with everything underneath them, and he heard it, and they sat with it between them like something lit. "I'm riding out next week to start clearing the site," he said. "The house won't go up this winter, ground's too hard for foundation work, but I can get the lumber ordered and the site staked and be ready to break ground in March." "March," Emma said. "March," he confirmed. She thought about March. She thought about the specific reality of March 4 months away, and what 4 months meant in terms of the conversation she was not yet having with herself, the one she had been circling for weeks. Will you stay in Willow Creek through the winter? She asked. Granger's offered me work through February, he said. I'll take it. The ranch needs the hands and I need the income while the land's being developed. So you'll be here, she said. Yes, ma'am. A pause. Unless you'd rather I wasn't. Emma looked at him. I'd rather you were, she said. It was the most direct thing she had said in 2 months. Caleb held very still. All right, he said, very carefully. Then I'll be here. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Emma's recent life, and she meant that in the way of strange things that are also good. The particular strangeness of a life rearranging itself around something new. Like furniture, moved in a room you've lived in long enough that you feel the difference even in the dark. Caleb was part of her days now, in the small, ordinary ways that were. She was discovering more significant than the large, dramatic ones. He stopped by the shop Tuesday and Thursday evenings, same as always. He occasionally appeared at midday with something from the Granger kitchen that Margaret had sent, a pie, a jar of preserved peaches, things that arrived with the cheerful obviousness of a woman who had decided Emma needed feeding and was acting on that decision without apology. Emma accepted these things and stopped pretending she didn't look forward to them. I had coffee with her on Saturday mornings, which had begun sometime in November, without either of them deciding it would. He'd arrived one Saturday morning with news about the land survey, and she'd made coffee because it was cold, and somehow by the third Saturday, it was simply a thing that happened. He fixed the hinge on her back door, which had been sticking since September, on a Tuesday afternoon, when he arrived early, and noticed it before she could tell him not to bother. She didn't tell him not to bother. She brought him a cup of coffee while he worked, and stood in the doorway, and watched him do it with the focused, efficient attention of a man who fixes things properly, rather than expediently, and felt something so ordinary and so warm that it frightened her because she recognized it not. Love, not exactly. Though love was certainly present, but the specific feeling of a person becoming necessary. Of someone fitting into the shape of your days so naturally that you start to feel the outline of where they'd be missing. She had felt that once before. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had felt that once before, and she had been catastrophically wrong. The doubt didn't come from Caleb. She knew that. She was very clear-eyed about where it came from. It came from her own history, from the scar tissue that her first husband had left that was no longer painful, but that changed the shape of certain things, the way an old break changes, the way a bone sits. She trusted Caleb. That was the strange part. She trusted him in the way you trust a thing that has earned it, rather than claimed it slowly through the accumulation of small, consistent, true things, rather than through grand statements. He had never told her who she should be. He had never pushed when she needed space. He had never made her feel that her independence was a problem to be solved or a phase to be waited out. He had simply been steady and honest, and there, and she had watched him be all of those things for 3 months now, and she trusted him. What she didn't trust was herself. That was the real conversation she'd been avoiding. She didn't trust her own judgment. She had trusted it once completely, and it had put her outside a locked house with 43 cents. And she had rebuilt herself so successfully in the aftermath that she had sometimes confused the reconstruction with the original, had sometimes told herself that the woman she was now, capable and solitary and self-sufficient, was simply who she was, rather than who she had needed to become. She was wrestling with that on a Thursday evening in mid-December, when Clara Booth came into the shop just before closing, not for an order, but with the particular directness of a woman who has decided to say something and has chosen her moment. Clara Booth ran the laundry. She was forthright and practical, and had laughed nearly 3 months ago when Emma had stopped Ruth Harker cold in the street. Emma liked her for that laugh, and for the absence of performance in everything she said. "I won't take up your time," Clara said. "I just wanted to say one thing." Emma put down her work. "Go ahead," she said. "I've watched you for 4 years," Clara said. "I've watched you run that shop and hold your head up and not take anything from anybody, and I have always thought that woman knows what she's worth." She looked at Emma directly. And I've watched you for the last 3 months, and I think you're scared. Which is reasonable. Any sensible person would be scared. She paused. But I also think you're using the fear as an excuse. Emma looked at her. An excuse for what? She asked. For not making a decision you've already made, Clara said simply. She held Emma's gaze. You already know what you want. I can see it every time he walks into a room. The question is whether you're going to let yourself have it, or whether you're going to find a reason not to until he stops waiting. Emma was quiet. He's patient, Clara said. More patient than most. But he's a man with land and plans and a life to build, and he's not going to wait forever, Emma. Not because he doesn't mean it. I think he means every word. But because at some point a person has to know whether they're building something together or alone. She paused. That's all, she said. I'll see you Sunday. She left. Emma sat alone in the empty shop and felt the truth of what Clara had said land in her with the particular weight of things that are not surprising, but that need to be said aloud before they become real. She already knew what she wanted. She had known since the valley. She had known since 2 windows, maybe before. She was using the fear as a reason to stay still. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her needle and worked until the lamp burned low, and when she went upstairs to bed, she lay awake and had finally the conversation with herself that she had been avoiding for 3 months. She was afraid. That was true and real, and not something she was going to pretend wasn't there. She was afraid of being wrong again. She was afraid of opening a door and finding that what was on the other side of it was not what she thought. She was afraid of the specific vulnerability of being known, of having allowed a person to see the interior of her life, the real one, the one below the capability and the independence and the carefully constructed sufficiency, and finding out too late that they could not be trusted with it. Those were real fears. They were also. She understood now in the dark above her shop, fears about a man who no longer existed in her life. They were fears about her first husband who was in Ohio, who had no part in this story. She was letting a ghost have a vote on her future. She was letting the worst thing that had ever happened to her decide what could happen next. She lay very still in the dark and thought about that. She thought about the fireplace where she'd melted the ring. She thought about the terrible clarifying peace of that morning. She had decided then that she was done. She had been right to decide that. She had needed to be done. She had needed 7 years of being done. 7 years of proving to herself that she could stand alone and build something real and be whole without anyone else holding the other side of it. She had done that. She was done with being done. The thought arrived with a simplicity that surprised her. Not dramatic, not accompanied by the rush of a great revelation. Just quiet and clear and true. The way simple things are true. She was done with being done. She wanted the valley. She wanted the house with the south room. She wanted Saturday mornings and coffee, and a man who fixed hinges and laughed at the right moments and sat still in her silences, as though they were something worth sitting in. She wanted her life, and she wanted this too. And she was allowed to want both. She fell asleep somewhere after midnight, and when she woke in the morning, the decision was still there, clear and quiet the way decisions are when they've been made properly. She went downstairs and opened the shop, and worked through the morning with a focused calm that was different from her usual focused calm. Lighter somehow, as though something that had been occupying weight in her chest had resolved itself and left more room. At noon, she took off her apron. She walked to the Granger Ranch. It was a 40-minute walk on the North Road, and it was cold, and she did not mind either of those things. She walked with the long-strided efficiency of a woman who knows where she's going and has decided to get there. She found Caleb in the barn. He looked up when she came in, and his expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, then the careful neutrality he used when he wasn't sure what was coming, then something that was not quite hope, because it was too controlled to be hope, but was in the same family. He set down what he was doing. "Emma," he said. She stopped in front of him. She had thought on the walk about what she was going to say. She had drafted various versions. She was a woman who was good with words, when they were about practical things. Measurements terms, the clear communication of what was needed and what was not. She was less practiced at using them for the interior things, the real ones. She discarded the drafts. She looked at him and said what was true. "I've been afraid," she said. "I want you to know that I know I've been afraid, and that the fear was about things that had nothing to do with you." She held his gaze. You have been exactly who you said you were from the first evening on the porch. Every single time. And I've been waiting for that to change because I'd been taught that it would, and it hasn't, and I—" She stopped. Steadied. "I'm asking you not to stop waiting." Caleb was very still. "Not yet," she said. "I need a little more time. But I wanted you to know that that it's not—" She pressed on. "I'm not keeping you at a distance because I don't want this. I'm keeping you at a distance because I'm learning how to want it again, and I don't want to do it badly." The silence afterward was not empty. It was the silence of two people standing in a barn in December, with their breath visible in the cold air, and something real and irreversible happening between them. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere." "You said that before," she said. "I'll keep saying it," he said, "until you believe it." Emma looked at him. She thought about the fireplace and Ohio and 43 cents. She thought about tomatoes growing in spite of everything. She thought about a valley in November and the words 2 windows and what it meant to say them. She said, "I believe it." It was 4 words. They were the truest 4 words she had said in 7 years. Caleb took 1 step forward. I was close enough that she could see the exact gray of his eyes, the particular tired lines of a man who had worked hard and been alone a long time and had somewhere in the past 3 months stopped looking quite so tired. He said very quietly, "May I?" She knew what he was asking. She said yes. He took her hand. He held it with the same careful, unhurried intention he brought to everything. Not claiming, not grasping, just holding. And Emma felt through the warmth of that contact the last remaining piece of the argument she had been having with herself. Simply stop. Not dramatically. Not with any ceremony. Just stopped. Like a sound that has been going on so long. You forgot it was there, and then it ends, and the quiet after it is the most extraordinary thing you've ever heard. They stood in the barn in the December cold, and he held her hand, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already being said. Then Emma looked up at him. "I'm going to need that south room finished before summer," she said. Caleb looked at her. Something broke open in his face, not apart, but open, the way a thing opens when it's been held closed for a long time and finally doesn't have to be. He laughed. The real laugh, the one she'd heard that first night over the impossible memory of a man refusing tomatoes on principle. Full and genuine and entirely unself-conscious. Emma felt it move through her like the first warm day after a long winter. "March," he said. "I'll break ground in March." "See that you do," she said. She did not let go of his hand. He did not let go of hers. Outside, the December wind moved through Willow Creek, and somewhere in the town, Emma Whitmore's shop stood with its closed sign up for the first time on a Thursday in 3 years, and nobody who mattered was inside it, because the woman who built it from nothing was standing in a barn on a cold afternoon, learning slowly and with great care how to let something in. Not instead of herself. Not at the cost of herself. Simply alongside. The way light comes in through a south window. Quietly. Steadily. Without permission. Simply because the window is there, and the window is open, and the morning has come. Abigail arrived on a Tuesday in February without warning. Emma opened the shop door at 8:30 in the morning, expecting the cold air, and instead found her sister standing on the porch with a traveling bag, and the expression of a woman who has rehearsed an apology for 3 months and is no longer sure it's adequate. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Emma stepped back from the door and said, "Come in out of the cold." And Abigail came in, and they stood in the middle of the shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric, and the smell of coffee, and 7 years of letters that had said everything except the real things. And Emma looked at her sister's face, older than she remembered, softer around the eyes, tired from the journey. and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was still locked. "I should have asked," Abigail said. She said it immediately before her coat was even off. "I know I should have asked. I've known it since the day I sent that letter to Caleb, and I've been awake about it ever since, and I'm sorry, Emma. I am truly sorry." Emma looked at her. She had imagined this conversation many times. In some versions, she was cold. In some versions, she said the sharp, precise things she was good at saying when people overstepped. In some versions, she made her sister understand with complete clarity exactly what it meant to have a choice made on her behalf without her knowledge. Instead, she crossed the shop in 4 steps and put her arms around her sister and held on, and Abigail made a small broken sound and held on back, and they stood like that for a long moment in the middle of Emma's shop while the coffee went on getting cold. "You're not angry," Abigail said into Emma's shoulder. "I was," Emma said. "I'm not anymore. I'm not." Abigail pulled back and looked at her, and whatever she saw in Emma's face made her own face do something complicated, relief and hope, and the particular expression of a woman who is afraid to ask the question she most wants answered. "He's still here," Emma said. Abigail exhaled. "Tell me," she said. They sat at the work table with fresh coffee, and Emma told her. Not everything, some things were too new, too interior, too much hers, to give away yet, but the shape of it. She told Abigail about the first evening on the porch and the 10 minutes that became 2 hours. She told her about the coffee and the questions, and the man who asked about the garden. She told her about the valley, about cottonwood trees and clear water and 2 windows in the south room. She told her about the barn in December and the hand held carefully and the laugh, the real one. Abigail listened with the focused stillness of someone who is trying to hear not just the words, but what's underneath them. When Emma finished, Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was the same question she'd written at the end of the letter Emma had carried in her apron pocket for 2 months. Emma thought about it. She did not answer immediately because the question deserved the honest answer rather than the easy one. "I'm not afraid of being happy," she said finally. "That's new." Abigail pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "That's everything," she said. Emma looked at her sister across the work table. "You still had no right," she said. "I know," Abigail said. "If he had been different, if he had been like Harold Finch or Arden Pruitt or that insufferable Reverend." "I know," Abigail said again. "I know that. I was gambling." "With my life," Emma said. "With your loneliness," Abigail said quietly. "Which I couldn't stand to watch anymore. Which is still not an excuse. But it's the truth." Emma held her gaze. "The truth," Emma said, "is that you were right. Which I will only say once, and never again." Abigail had the wisdom not to smile too visibly. "Once is enough," she said. Caleb met Abigail that Thursday evening, and Emma watched the meeting with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting to see 2 separate parts of their life occupy the same room. She expected it to be awkward. She expected the weight of what Abigail had done, the chain of correspondence and arrangement and well-meaning interference that had brought them all to this point, to sit between the 3 of them with some discomfort. It didn't. Caleb knocked at 6 and came in and took off his hat and looked at Abigail with an expression that was straightforward and uncomplicated, the expression he brought to things that he had already made his peace with. "Mrs. Carver," he said. "Mr. Mercer," Abigail said, and looked at him with the focused attention of someone taking a thorough inventory. There was a brief silence. "I hear you've been taking care of my sister," Abigail said. "Your sister takes care of herself," Caleb said without hesitation. "I've just been trying to be worth her time." Emma watched Abigail receive that. She watched her sister look at this man, the worn coat, the hat in his hands, the steady gray eyes with the tired lines around them, and she watched something settle in Abigail's expression. Not approval exactly, something quieter. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who has known her sister long enough to understand what Emma needed, and who was looking at a man who apparently also understood it. "You'll do," Abigail said. Caleb Mercer smiled. The real one. They sat together all 3 at the work table, and Abigail told stories about their childhood that Emma had not heard in years. The summer their father had tried to build a chicken coop, and it had collapsed twice the winter. Emma had taught herself to sew at 11 years old, using a curtain and a needle she'd found in their mother's sewing box, and the results had been, by Abigail's account, structurally ambitious, if aesthetically troubling. Emma listened to her own past being handed back to her in her sister's voice, and felt the strangeness and sweetness of it, the way the past becomes something different when someone who was there tells it. Caleb listened, and laughed in the right places, and asked the right questions, and Emma noticed, with the particular awareness she'd developed over 4 months, that he was not performing interest. He was genuinely interested. He was interested in the 11-year-old girl who taught herself to sew from a curtain, because that girl was present in the woman sitting across from him, and he knew it. She looked at him across the work table, while Abigail was talking, just for a moment, just a glance, and he caught it and held it for exactly 1 second before they both looked back at Abigail. And in that 1 second, Emma felt the full weight of what they had built together, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through coffee going cold and honest questions, and a man who held a door open and waited. Abigail stayed a week. It was the first time Emma had spent 7 consecutive days with another person in 7 years, and she had expected it to feel like an intrusion, a disruption to the rhythm she had built. Instead, it felt like something that had been missing without a name. They fell back into the ease of sisters, with the surprising speed of people who discover that years of distance haven't altered the fundamental frequency at which they understand each other. Abigail helped in the shop some mornings, not sewing. She was firm about her limitations there, but receiving customers and sorting orders, and doing the kind of cheerful, efficient front-of-house work that Emma alone had always done herself. Emma found she didn't mind the help. That surprised her. On the 5th day, Abigail said what she had been building toward all week. They were alone in the shop late afternoon, the light going amber through the front window. "He's going to ask you," Abigail said. "Soon." Emma didn't look up from her work. "Is that an observation or information?" she said. "Observation," Abigail said. "I've been watching him watch you." A pause. "He's trying to find the right moment. He doesn't want to rush you." Emma set down her needle. "Abigail," she said. "I know," her sister said. "I'm not interfering. I'm informing." She picked up a button and turned it in her fingers. "I just want to know when he does. Are you ready?" Emma looked at her hands on the work table. The question was a real one. Not rhetorical, not leading. A real question from a woman who knew her better than anyone alive, and was asking it plainly. Was she ready? She thought about December in the barn, and a hand held with care. She thought about Saturday mornings that had become the best part of her week. She thought about a valley in November, and the specific quality of a man's laugh when you've said something true. She thought about the south room with 2 windows, and the life she had built, and the life that was possible, and the fact that she was allowed to have both. "Yes," she said. Abigail nodded once. She put the button down. She picked up her mending and said nothing more. That was on a Wednesday. On Friday, Caleb arrived at the shop, not at 6 in the evening, but at noon, which was unusual enough that Emma felt it before she understood it. A slight shift in the quality of the air, the way it felt when something was about to change. He knocked, and she opened the door, and he was standing there in the cold midday light, with his hat in his hands and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not nervous exactly. Caleb was rarely nervous in any obvious way. But something in him was concentrated the way he looked when he had decided to say a real thing and was making sure the words were right. "Can you close for an hour?" he asked. Emma looked at him. She turned the sign on the door without a word. She got her coat. They walked, and he did not say anything for 2 full blocks, and Emma let the silence be what it was, because she knew him well enough now to know that silence before important things was not avoidance, but preparation. They reached this edge of town, where the road opened up and the land spread out bare and cold, and the sky was the pale winter blue that preceded snow, and he stopped walking. He turned to face her. His hat was in both hands. She had seen him hold his hat that way 100 times, and she knew what it meant. Now, it was not nervousness, it was respect. It was a man reminding himself that he was a guest in the space of someone else's decision. "I have the land," he said. "I have the plans for the house. I have enough saved to break ground in March and enough contracted to have walls up before summer." He looked at her directly. "I have everything I set out to build. Everything except the thing that would make it more than just a house." Emma stood very still. "I'm not going to tell you that you need me," he said. "You don't. You have never needed anyone, and you've proven it more completely than most people ever get the chance to. I'm not asking you to need me." He paused. "I'm asking you to want this. To want—" He stopped, started again. "I'm asking you to marry me, Emma. Not because your sister sent me. Not because the town expects it. Because I have spent 4 months watching you, and I cannot imagine building that house and knowing you're not in it." The wind came through quietly. Emma looked at him. She thought about the ring in the fireplace and the peace of that morning. She thought about 43 cents and a worn suitcase and a cold, empty room that became something extraordinary. She thought about every wall she had ever built, and the precise, careful, painstaking labor it had taken to build them, and about the man standing in front of her, who had never once tried to take a hammer to any of them, but had simply patiently been present until she decided on her own to open the door. She said, "Ask me one thing first." He waited. "If I say yes," she said, "the shop stays mine. My income is mine. My work is mine. My name—" She stopped. "I'll take your name, but Emma doesn't go anywhere. Who I am doesn't change." "No," he said immediately without a moment's pause. "It doesn't change. That's not what I'm asking for." "And if I have a bad week," she said, "and I go quiet, and I need 3 days of not talking much, I'll be there when you come back to talking," he said. "And if I'm right about something and you're wrong—" "Then you're right," he said simply. Emma looked at him. "You make that sound easy," she said. "I make it sound like what it is," he said. "Which is two people who've both been alone long enough to know exactly what they don't want." He held her gaze. "I don't want someone who disappears. You don't want someone who crowds you. That's not a complication, Emma. That's a solution." She stood in the cold road at the edge of Willow Creek and looked at Caleb Mercer and thought that of all the ways she had imagined this moment might come in all the versions she had privately considered and cautiously allowed herself to consider, she had not imagined it being this clear. She had expected it to still feel like standing at a ledge. It didn't. It felt like stepping onto solid ground. "Yes," she said. He went very still. "Yes," she said again, in case the first one hadn't been enough. "I'll marry you." He looked at her for a long moment. That look, she had come to know the one past hope and past gratitude. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't speak. He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had in the barn in December. Careful and unhurried. And he held it, and they stood in the cold road at the edge of the town. She had built herself out of nothing. And he said very quietly, "Thank you." 2 words. The same 2 words she had given him in November, and they meant the same thing now that his had meant. "Then I know what this cost you. I know what you're giving me. I won't waste it." She squeezed his hand once. They walked back to town. The wedding was on the first Saturday in April. Abigail came back for it with Thomas and their 2 youngest, and Margaret Granger presided over the practical elements, with the cheerful authority of a woman who has never met a logistical problem she didn't enjoy solving. Clara Booth brought food. A dozen women from town came, including to Emma's private amusement, Mrs. Haverford from the dry goods store, who cried openly and without embarrassment from the 3rd row. Ruth Harker did not come. Emma noticed, but did not spend time on it. The ceremony was held in the small white church at the north end of Main Street, and Emma wore a dress she had made herself not white, because she was 30 years old, and honest about being 30 years old. But the deep blue of a winter sky, the same color as the wool she'd been using when Caleb first sat at her work table. She had made the dress over 3 evenings in the week before the wedding, and it was without question the finest thing she had ever sewn. She walked into the church alone. She had discussed this with Caleb when the question arose. Some people had assumed Thomas would walk her in standing in for a father no longer living. Some had assumed Abigail would accompany her. Caleb had asked what she wanted. She had said she wanted to walk in herself because she had arrived in Willow Creek alone and built something alone, and she wanted the woman who had done that to be the one who chose to walk toward him, not escorted but choosing. He had said, "Then that's what we'll do." So she walked in alone. She walked down the aisle of the small church with every eye in the room on her, with Abigail crying quietly in the front row, and Margaret Granger nodding with the satisfied expression of a woman whose instincts have been confirmed. And she walked toward Caleb, who was standing at the front of the church in a clean dark coat, with his hat in his hands. Because he was not a man who changed his fundamental nature for occasions, and who was looking at her with the expression she had been trying for 4 months to find a word for. She had found it somewhere in February. The word was home. Not a place. Not a role. Not a transaction. Just the particular way a person looks at you when you are the thing they were trying to get back to. She reached the front of the church and stood beside him, and the minister said the words, and they said the words back. And when it came to the part where she said, "I will," she said it with the same voice she used for everything that mattered, even direct entirely without performance. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it. It was a simple band, plain silver, nothing extravagant. She had told him what she wanted, and he had listened, and this was it. She looked up at him. "Well," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Well," he agreed, and the ghost of the smile was fully present now, the real one. They turned to face the room. The room applauded with the particular warmth of people who have watched something real happen, rather than something performed. And Abigail was no longer trying to be quiet about the crying. And Margaret Granger was not crying, but had the expression of a woman who had decided not to purely as a matter of personal policy. Clara Booth caught Emma's eye from the middle of the room and gave her a look that said simply and completely, "Good." Emma looked at her and nodded once. It was enough. The house in Bridger Valley went up in the spring. Ground broken in March as promised. Walls up by June. The south room was last because Caleb was building the house from the structure outward, and the south room was the detail that everything else was built to contain. And when he finally called Emma out to the valley on a Thursday afternoon in July, and showed her what he'd done, she stood in the doorway of the finished room and did not speak for a full minute. 2 windows exactly as she'd said, south-facing wide, the kind of windows that held the morning light for hours. The cutting table he had built himself was under the left window. The right dimensions, the right height. He had measured her work table in the shop when she wasn't looking, and replicated the height exactly which she discovered when she stood at it and felt her hands settle at exactly the right level. The shelves along the east wall were spaced for bolts of fabric. The floor was smooth-planed hardwood that would not catch thread. He had thought of everything. Not the way someone thinks of things when they are trying to impress. The way someone thinks of things when they are paying attention. She stood at the cutting table with her hands flat on the surface and looked out through the south windows at the valley, the creek glinting in the July heat, the north slope green now in summer, the open sky above the low hills, and felt the collision of everything she had been and everything she was choosing to become, and found to her own considerable surprise that there was no collision at all. They were the same person. The woman who had thrown the ring in the fire. The woman who had stood in an empty room with 43 cents and decided it was going to become something. The woman who had opened the door to a tired stranger holding his hat. The woman standing in a south-facing room in a valley she now lived in. The same woman all the way through. She had been afraid for a long time that letting someone in would require becoming someone else. That love was a negotiation in which you surrendered pieces of yourself in exchange for the pieces you received. That opening the door meant the walls came down. The walls were still there. She was still herself, particular and capable and clear-eyed, and in possession of opinions she would express without apology. She had simply finally also opened the door. Caleb was standing in the doorway of the south room watching her. She turned to look at him. "The height of the table," she said. "Measured it in February," he said. "When you were in the back." "I figured," she said. She looked at the windows. "It's right," she said. "All of it. It's right." He came into the room and stood beside her, and they both looked out the south windows at the valley, and the light was the specific, generous light of a July afternoon, the kind that made everything look like it had been considered and placed. "I have something for you," he said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and took out an envelope. She recognized the handwriting on the front immediately. Abigail. Emma looked at him. She sent it a month ago, he said. She asked me to give it to you when the south room was finished. Emma took the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it in Abigail's rounded, careful script was a drawing, small, simple, done in pencil, of two girls in a garden. One taller, one smaller. Between them, a row of tomato plants. Below the drawing, Abigail had written, "You always grew things well, even in bad soil, especially in bad soil. I'm so glad you found good soil. Love always, A." Emma stood in the south room with the letter in her hands and felt something move through her that she was not going to try to name or contain or manage, something that was grief and gratitude and the specific ache of loving a sister across distance for 7 years and the particular joy of a life that had turned out to hold more than she'd allowed herself to believe it would. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her apron pocket where she kept the things she wanted to carry with her. Caleb stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a while, she reached out and took his hand. He held it the same way he always did, carefully, without claiming, with the specific warmth of someone who knows the difference between holding on and holding down. She looked out the south windows at the valley. She thought about the long straight road from Ohio to here. About every step of it, the hard ones, and the lonely ones, and the ones that had seemed in the moment like more than she could manage. She thought about an empty room, and 43 cents, and the extraordinary stubborn act of deciding that it was going to be enough to begin with. She thought about every dress she had made, and every morning she had worked alone in the quiet above the shop, and every evening she had climbed the stairs and told herself the quiet was peace. She had not been wrong. It had been peace. It had also been the waiting ground for something she had not been ready for until she was. She was ready now. She was standing in a room built for her by a man who had listened when she spoke, and was quiet when she needed quiet, and had fixed the hinge on her back door without being asked, and laughed at the right moment over Ohio tomatoes, and held her hand in a barn in December, and waited without impatience, without pressure, without once trying to tell her who she should be, while she found her way back to being willing to be known. She was standing in the room with good southern light, and the valley opening out in front of her, and his hand in hers, and the letter from her sister in her pocket, and the whole long rest of her life ahead. She had built this. Not the room, not the house, not the valley, herself. She had built herself out of the worst material imaginable into a woman strong enough to survive alone, and wise enough finally to know that surviving alone had never been the point. The point was this room, this hand, this life that was entirely and completely hers, and that she had chosen with full knowledge, with open eyes, with every scar and every lesson, and every morning of solitude, carried forward intact to share. 6 months later, Abigail's letter arrived at the Valley address, forwarded from the old shop address in Willow Creek by Mrs. Haverford, who had in the end proved useful for something. The letter asked one question. It was the same question it always asked. Are you happy? Emma sat at the cutting table in the south room with the morning light coming through both windows and a half-finished dress in front of her, and the sound of Caleb working somewhere outside that particular sound that she had listened for without admitting she was listening for it since December, and she thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about what happy meant to a woman who had spent 7 years proving she didn't need it. She picked up her pen. She wrote yes. Not because someone completed me, because I was already complete and I found someone who knew it. She sealed the letter. She looked out the south window. The valley was full of September light. The cottonwoods were turning going yellow, the way he had described that first October on her porch, lit all at once like something on fire. She had thought at the time that it sounded beautiful. She had been right. It was. She picked up her needle and went back to work in her room, in her valley, in her life, which had always been hers, and always would be, and was now also richly and truly, and without condition, his. Both things. At once. That was the truth about Emma Whitmore Mercer. She was never a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who built something extraordinary out of almost nothing, and survived things that would have broken others, and kept every wall standing for exactly as long as she needed them. And then when she was ready on her own terms in her own time, opened the door herself. No one pushed it open. No one broke it down. She opened it, because she was strong enough to survive alone, and strong enough to know when alone was finished, and strong enough to choose something better, without it costing her a single piece of who she was. That is what strength looks like. Not walls that never open. A door that opens only when you're ready. And when it does, light comes through. Good light. Southern light. The kind that